Chapter 28 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham MARTYN. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 28 The German Spy Merchant. Anthony Trent rode into Kennebago by the corduroy road from Rangeley. It took longer, but it seemed a less likely way of being seen than if he had taken the train to Kennebago. It had been his intention, before Kaufmann had come across his horizon, to make the call upon Mr. Westward his first action. As he stood at the window of the big dining room, he could see the genial angler, and John his guide, rowing over to the edge of a favourite pool. There he sat in the stern, rod in hand, no doubt thinking of the chapter he was writing on the psychology of trout. For years Anthony Trent had looked forward to days like this in his new home, but the thrill of it was gone. He had hoped to look over the lake to the purple hills beyond with a serenity of mind that might now never be his. How much did Kaufmann know? Would he lodge information with the police? Dare he? Probably he would not dare to call. But anonymous information of so important a character would speedily bring detectives on his trail. Beyond a question, he should have bought a camp on some far Canadian lake under another name and reached it by devious ways. He had betrayed much ingenuity in bringing himself, Mrs. Kinney and their baggage to Kennebago as it was. Successions of taxis from hotel to station and from station to hotel, crossing his own tracks a half-dozen times, would make pursuit difficult. He had no way of estimating Kaufmann's skill at following a clue. But the man had impressed him, Anthony Trent, who had foiled so many. Next morning he determined to fish, and was attending to his rods with the loving care of the conscientious angler, when a knock came at the door. It opened onto the big screened piazza. "Come in," he shouted, thinking Mrs. Kinney wished to consult him. Instead there entered Mr. Westward, who greeted him heartily. It was indeed an honor, for the piscatorial expert called upon few. "Glad to see you, my dear fellow," said Westward, shaking him by the hand. "I happened to meet a friend of yours who was coming to see you and lost his way, so I've brought him along." Kaufmann also wrung his hand. He seemed no less delighted to see Trent than at Mr. Westward. "What a charming retreat you have here," he exclaimed cordially. There followed a conversation concerning trout and salmon which under normal conditions would have been delightful to Trent. Kaufmann was affable, genial, and talked of the finny spoils of his native lakes. It was only when Westward's erect form had disappeared down the path that his manner became forbidding. "Why did you leave New York?" he snapped. "Because I chose to," said the other. "What a fool! What a fool!" cried Kaufmann. "And how fortunate that I am good-tempered." "Why?" Trent demanded. "Because I might have had you investigated by the police. Instead I followed you here, not without difficulty I admit, and to renew my offer." He looked about the luxurious house that was miscalled a camp. It was not the kind of home a man would lose willingly. "I ask very little. I only want a certain package of letters which a man who lands tomorrow in New York has in his possession. One so skilled as you can get it easily. You have presence, education, ready wit. I confess it is difficult for me to believe you have sunk so low." Anthony Trent flushed angrily. "There are lower depths yet," he exclaimed. "Yes," the other returned. "As for instance?" "Your sort of work," he cried. "Do you suppose I imagine you to be a Swiss silk merchant of Bahnhof Street?" Kaufmann threw back his head and laughed. "My passport, recently vised by your State Department, is made out to Adolf Kaufmann of Zurich. I have Swiss friends in New York and Chicago who will identify me." "Naturally," said Trent. "Simple precautions of that sort would have to be taken. That's elementary." "Let us get back to business," said the other. "I want those papers. Will you get them for me? Think it over well. You may say you will not. You may say you prefer to remain here in this delightful place and catch trout. Let us suppose that you say you defy me. What happens? You lose all chance to look at trout for 10, 15, 20 years, accordingly as the judge regards your offenses. I've mentioned only 2 crimes to you. Of these I have data and I'm certain. There are 2 others in which I can interest myself if necessary. I do not wish to bother myself with you after you do as I command. Get me the papers, and you may remain here till you have grandchildren of marriageable age. Is it worth defying me, Mr. Trent?" The younger man groaned as he thought it over. The fabric he had made so carefully was ready to fall apart. Kaufmann went on talking. "The man you must follow is called Commander Godfrey Heathcote, of the British Navy. On his breast he wears the ribbons of the Victoria Cross, a blue one for the Navy, and the red ribbon, edged with blue, of the Distinguished Service Order. He is a man much of your build, but has straw-colored hair and light blue eyes. He walks with a limp owing to a wound received at the Zeebrugge affair. He is supposed to be over here to stay with relatives who have a place on the James River. He leaves for Washington soon, where his business is with the Secretary of the Navy. The papers I want are in a pigskin cigarette case, old and worn. You'd better bring the case in its entirety." Kaufmann rattled off his instructions in a sure and certain manner. Evidently he had no fear of being denied. "Isn't it unusual for an English naval commander to carry trade secrets about with him?" Trent demanded. "Why keep up the farce?" Kaufmann exclaimed. "You too are a man of the world. You realize you are in my power and must do as you are bid." "Must I?" Trent answered with a frown. "I am asked to play the traitor to my country and you expect me to accept without hesitation." "Why not?" Kaufmann returned. "Would you be the first that fear of exposure has led into such ways? If I were to tell you how we—" He paused a moment and then smiled. "How we silk merchants of Switzerland have used our knowledge of the black pages of men's lives or the indiscretions of well-known women, you would understand more readily how we obtain what we want." "I understand," said Anthony Trent gloomily. He was a case in point. "And you will save yourself?" "I don't know," said Trent hesitating. But he knew that Kaufmann had made such threats as these to others and had gained his desires. "What's in those papers?" "Dye formulae," smiled the elder man. Anthony Trent looked at him angrily. His nerves were on edge. Plainly Kaufmann felt it unwise to stir the smoldering passion in him. "England," he informed the other, "has recently reorganized the minefields outside Sheerness at the mouth of the Thames. Commander Heathcote, who is here ostensibly to recuperate from wounds, is chosen to carry the plans to the Navy Department. There you have all I know." "But that's treachery," Trent cried. "What's England to you?" Kaufmann answered. "Or you to England? I'm not asking you to take American plans." "It's the same thing now," Trent persisted. "We're allies and what's treachery to one is treachery to the other." "Admirable," Kaufmann sneered. "Admirable. But I invite you to come down to Mother Earth. You are not concerned with the affairs of nations. You are concerned only with your own safety, which is the nearer task. You get those plans or you go to prison. You realize my power. I need you. You may ask why I've gone to this trouble to take you, a stranger, more or less into my confidence. Very well. I shall tell you. My own men are working like slaves in your accursed internment camps and I am alone, who had so many to command." "Alone?" said Anthony Trent in an altered voice and looked at him oddly. Kaufmann observed the look and laughed. "I'm a mind reader," he said cheerfully. "I will tell you what is passing through your brain. You are wondering whether if those strong hands of yours get a grip of my throat your own troubles too would not be at an end. No, my friend, I still have my Bayard with me. And why run the risk, if you should overpower me, of being tried for murder? What I ask of you is very little. Remember also that I have but to say the word and you land in prison." "You'd go with me," Trent exclaimed. "I think not," smiled Kaufmann. "Jerome Dangerfield and others would vouch for me, whereas I fear you would be friendless. And even if I were interned, how would that help you? Be sensible and get ready to accompany me to New York on the 5 o'clock train. I have your reservations." It was not easy to explain things to Mrs. Kinney. Trent told her that his suspicions of Kaufmann's German sympathies were wrong. He said he was compelled to get the dye formulae and would return within a few days. "I shall come too," Mrs. Kinney observed. "I left a lot of my things at the flat and I shall need them." It seemed to Trent that she was not deceived by his words, and while he would have preferred to leave her in Maine, he could think of no reason for keeping her there if she wished to leave. All the way he was gloomy. To Kaufmann's sallies he made morose answers. Presently the so-called Swiss left him alone. But Trent could not escape the feeling that his every action was watched. He was to all intents and purposes bond servant to an enemy of his country. "Just a final word," said Kaufmann as they neared the 125th Street station. "What else?" Trent said impatiently. He was filled with disgust with himself and of hatred for the German. "Remember that the cigarette case which holds my formulae is a long flat one holding 12 cigarettes. On it is stamped G.H. He does not secrete it as you think, but exposes it carelessly to view. I advise you to go straight to your apartment and await my letter. It is necessary for me to find out particulars which it might be unwise for you to do. I don't want you to fall under suspicion." "You are very thoughtful," sneered Trent. He knew well enough that he had a value in Kaufmann's eyes which would be destroyed were he to come under police supervision. That this was the only case where he was to be used was unlikely. Having used him once he would be at their command again. But would he? Anthony Trent sat back in his chair, deep lines on his drawn white face. This was the reward of the life he had led. And the way to break from Kaufmann's grip was to run the risk of the long prison term or the taking of a life. And even were he to come to this, Kaufmann might be only one of a gang whose other members might command his services. "I shall send you a message by telephone if it is still in your flat. It is? Good. That simplifies matters. Wait until you receive it and then act immediately." Anthony Trent disregarded the outstretched hand and cordial smile when a minute or so later the train pulled into the Grand Central. He hailed a taxi and drove to his rooms, utterly obsessed with his bitter thoughts. It was not until he pulled up the shades and glanced about the place that he remembered Mrs. Kinney. He had forgotten her. But he relied on her common sense. Sooner or later she would come. Meanwhile he must wait for Kaufmann's telephone message. The message arrived before the woman. "Tomorrow," said Kaufmann, "your friend leaves for Washington. He is staying at the Carlton and goes to his room after dinner. He will be pleased to see you. Tomorrow night I shall call upon you soon after dark." The Carlton was the newest of the hotels, the most superbly decorated, the hotel that always disappointed the nouveau riche because so little gold leaf had been used in the process. Anthony Trent had spent a night or two in every big hotel the city boasted. In a little notebook there were certain salient features carefully put down, hints which might be useful to him. Turning to the book he read it carefully. He was already acquainted with the general layout of the hotel, which had been generously explained in the architectural papers. The hotel detectives were men of whom he liked to learn as much as possible. The house detective, the head of them, was Francis Xavier Glynn, who felt himself kin to Gaboriau because of his subtle methods. He would often come to the hotel desk and register, talking in a loud tone about his Western business connections. He dressed in what he assumed was the Western manner. To his associates this seemed the height of cunning. As a matter of fact, the high-class crook who prefers the high-class hotel knew of it and was amused. Clark was Trent's informant. The old editor had pointed him out to the younger man one day when they had met near enough to the hotel's cafe entrance to go in and have a drink. As a rule Trent made elaborate plans for the successful carrying out of his work, but here he was suddenly told to engage in a very difficult operation. Disguises must be good indeed to stand the glare of hotel corridors and dining rooms. He decided to go and trust to some plan suggesting itself when the moment arrived. He registered as Conway Parker of York, Pennsylvania, and the grip which the boy carried to his room had on it C.P. York, P.A. Trent had given a couple of dollars for it at a second-hand store. It dulled suspicions which might have been aroused were the bag and initials glaringly new. It was part of Francis Xavier Glynn's plan to have the hotel boys report hourly on any unusual happening. As Trent had waited to register, he noted the name he was looking for, Commander Heathcote, had a room on the 17th floor. Parker was assigned to one on the 7th. Directly the boy had left, Anthony Trent started to work. he found just cause of offence so far as the location of his room went. It was an inside room, and the heat of the day made it oppressive. Commander Heathcote, as he found by taking a trip to the 17th floor, had an outside room. A further investigation proved that immediately over the commander's room was an unoccupied suite. To effect the exchange was not easy. Trent could not very well dictate the location of the room or betray so exact a knowledge of hotel topography without incurring suspicion. But at last the thing was done. The gentleman from York wanted a sitting room, bedroom and bath, and obtained it immediately over those of the naval officer. He passed Heathcote in the dining room and looked at him keenly. The two men were of a height. Heathcote was broader. Trent instantly knew him for that fighting type characterized by the short straight nose, cleft chin and light blue eyes. It was a man to beware of in an encounter. He limped a little and walked with a cane. And while he waited for his hors d'oeuvre, he took out a long pigskin cigarette case. It was within 10 feet of the man who had come to steal it. For a wild moment he wondered whether it were possible to lunge for it and make his escape. A moment later he was annoyed that such a puerile thought had visited him. It meant that his nerves were not under their usual control. After dinner 2 or 3 men spoke to the commander as he limped toward the elevator. One, a British colonel, shook hands heartily and congratulated him on the V.C. Another, a stranger evidently, tried to get him into conversation. Trent noted that the commander, although courteous to a degree, was not minded to make hotel acquaintances. He declined a drink and refused a cigar by taking out his cigarette case. The stranger looked at it curiously. "Seen some service, hasn't it?" the affable stranger remarked and took it from the owner's hand. "A very old pal," said the naval man. Trent had observed the slight hesitation before he had permitted it to leave his hand. "I wouldn't lose it for a lot." Trent stood ready. It might be that this thick-skinned stranger was after the same loot as he, but he handed it back and strolled off to the cafe where he joined a group of perfectly respectable businessmen from Columbus, O. As most travelers in first-class hotels know, the 18th story of the Carlton looks across a block of fashionable private houses on its north side. There is on that account no possibility of any prying stranger gazing into its rooms from across the way. Towering above these lesser habitations, the Carlton looms inaccessible, austere, remote. In the grip which had once belonged to the unknown C.P. of York, Pa., Anthony Trent had put the kit necessary for a short stay. There was also certain equipment without which certain nervous travelers rarely stray from home. For example, there was a small axe. In a collision at sea, many are drowned who might escape did not the impact have the effect of jamming the doors of their staterooms. The axe in the hands of the thoughtful voyager could be used to hack through thin planking to freedom. There was also a small coil of high-grade rope, tested to 300 pounds. In case of fire, the careful traveler might slide to earth. Not, of course, from an 18th floor. At 1:30 that night it was very dark and cloudy. A light rain dropped on dusty streets and there was silence. Tying his line to the firm anchorage of a pipe in the bathroom, Anthony Trent began his work. He was dressed in a dark blue suit. He wore no collar and on his hands were dark grey gloves. Below him was the green and white striped awning that protected Commander Heathcote's windows. It was almost certain that an Englishman would sleep with windows open. It was not difficult for a gymnast to slide down the rope head foremost. When Trent could touch the top of the Heathcote awning, he took a safety razor blade from his lips and cut a slit across it sufficiently wide to admit his head and shoulders. It was not a descent which caused much trouble. There was the chance that the rope might break. He wondered through how many awnings he would plunge before consciousness left him. Heathcote was asleep. By a table near the bed was an ashtray, matches, Conrad's Youth, and the cigarette case. And lying near was the stout cane which the man who was wounded in that splendid attack on Zeebrugge used to aid himself in his halting walk. Trent, with the case in his pocket, walked to the door. It was not his intention to make the more hazardous climb up to his room when so easy a way of getting there presented itself. It was locked and barred. In his room he sat and looked at what he had taken. It represented, so Kaufmann said, his freedom from arrest. It contained plans of vital importance to the Allies. They could only be used by the enemy to bring destruction to those who fought for right. And what punishment would be given the wounded hero for losing what was entrusted to him? For an hour Trent sat there looking at the pigskin case, and gradually what had seemed an impossible sacrifice to make came to be something desirable and splendid. Anthony Trent had never been able to regard his career as one justified by circumstances. There burned in his breast the spark of patriotism more strongly than he knew. He had fought his fight and won. His eyes were moist as he thought of his father, that old Civil War soldier who had been wounded on Gettysburg's bloody field and walked always with a limp like the English soldier beneath. When he opened the door, Heathcote was still slumbering. He replaced the case as nearly in the position he found as he could. In that moment Anthony Trent felt he could look any man in the face. He was still slumbering when Commander Heathcote awoke. Presently the officer saw that the door was unbarred and, as investigation proved, unlocked. "I'd have sworn," muttered the commander, "that I locked and barred it." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham MARTYN. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 29. Mrs. Kinney Intervenes. At his apartment, which he reached by noon, he found a note from Mrs. Kinney advising him that she would not be back until late. A salad would be found in the ice box. But his appetite had deserted him, and strong tea and crackers sufficed him. The feeling of exaltation which had carried him along was now dying down, leaving in its place a grim, dogged determination. He saw now very clearly that the time was come to pay for his misdeeds. Dimly he had felt that some day there would have to be a reckoning. He had never thought it so near. It would not have been difficult to make his escape from the man who threatened. With his swift motor he could cross some sparsely peopled border district into Canada. Or he could drop down into South or Central America and there wait until the years brought safety, or he had deteriorated in fibre, as do most men of his race in tropic sloth. The thing that kept him was a chivalrous burning desire to capture Kaufmann. Anthony Trent wondered how many men weaker than he had been forced to betray their country as he had very nearly done, and the knowledge that he had even considered such baseness for a moment awakened a deep smouldering wrath in his mind that needed for its outlet some expression of physical force. Kaufmann was strongly built and rugged, but it would hardly be a smiling suave spy that he would drag before the police. At least they would go down to ruin together. At 10:30 the bell rang, but the feeble steps that made their weary ascent were those of Mrs. Kinney. When first he flung open the door he hardly recognized her. As a rule neat and quietly dressed in black, she was tonight wearing the faded gingham dress he used for rough work, a dress he had seldom seen. She wore no hat. Instead a handkerchief was on her head. She looked for all the world like some shabby denizen of the city's foreign quarters. "Are you expecting him?" she demanded. "Yes," he said dully. It was a shock not to meet him when he was nerved to the task. She looked at him with a certain triumph in her face that was not unmixed with affection. "He will never come here again." "What do you mean?" he cried. "He's dead." It was curious to note the flash of her usually mild eye as she said it. For a moment he thought the old woman was demented, but her voice was firm. "I followed him on his way here," she went on. "I found out where he lived. As he crossed 8th Avenue at 34th Street, I told people he was a German spy. There were a lot of soldiers on their way to the Pennsylvania station and they started to run after him. Then a man tripped him up, but he got to his feet and crossed the road in front of a motor truck." "You are certain he was killed?" "I waited to make sure," she said simply. "Nobody knew it was I who started calling him a spy." There was a pause of half a minute. The knowledge of his safety was almost too much for Trent after his hours of suspense. "I suppose you know," he said huskily, "that you've probably saved my life. I didn't do as he wanted me to. I was prepared to denounce him to the police." "But they'd have got you too," she said. "I know," he returned. "I'd thought of that." "Oh, Mr. Trent," she cried. "Oh, Mr. Trent." Then for the second time in the years he had known her she fell into a fit of weeping. When she was recovered and had taken a cup of strong tea she explained how it was she had tracked Kaufmann to his home. She had slipped away from Trent at the Grand Central when he was too much worried to notice it. Kaufmann walked the half dozen blocks to his rooms in the house occupied by a physician on 48th Street, just west of Fifth Avenue. Applying for work, Mrs. Kinney was engaged instantly for 2 days a week. The need for respectable women was so great that no references were asked. She was thus free of the house and regarded without suspicion. She worked there the whole day but learned nothing from the cook and waitress of Mr. Kaufmann. He rented the whole of the second floor and had a fad for keeping it in order himself. It saved them trouble. The maid said vaguely he was in the importing business and very wealthy. It was while Kaufmann went down to sign for a registered letter that Mrs. Kinney slipped into the room. There was nothing in the way of papers or documents that she could see. Because he could not bear investigation, Anthony Trent telephoned to the Department of Justice as he had done in the case of Frederick Williams. He felt certain that Kaufmann was a highly placed official. But there was no newspaper mention of the raid. Trent was not to know that no news was allowed to leak out for the reason that matters of enormous importance were discovered. He was right in assuming Kaufmann to be a personage. The mangled body was buried in the potter's field and those lesser men depending on the monetary support and counsel of Kaufmann were thrown into confusion. His superiors in Germany, when later they found the Allies in possession of certain secrets, assumed their agent to be interned. Altogether, Mrs. Kinney deserved her country's thanks. "And now shall we go back to Kennebago?" "Not yet," he said, smiling a little gravely. "Not yet. It may be I shall never see Kennebago again." She looked at him startled. The affairs of the past week had been a great strain to her. "I'm going to enlist," he said. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham MARTYN. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 30. Private Trent. Before Trent went to enlist, he had an understanding with Mrs. Kinney as to the Kennebago camp. She was to live there and keep the house and gardens in good order until he returned. He had none of those premonitions of disaster which some who go to war have in abundance. Now that the danger of his arrest was gone and Kaufmann could never again entrap him, he felt cheerful and light-hearted. "I shall come back," he told the old woman. "I feel it in my bones. But if not, there will be enough for you to live on. I'm seeing my lawyer about it this morning." On the way to the recruiting station, Trent met Weems. "What branch are you going in?" he asked upon learning of Trent's plans. "Where I'm most needed," Trent said cheerfully. "Infantry, I guess." "You can get a commission right away," Weems cried, a sudden thought striking him. "It was in last night's papers. It said that men holding the B.S. degree were wanted and would be commissioned right off the reel. You're a B.S. You wait a bit. Be an officer instead of an enlisted man. I bet the food's better." He was a little piqued that Anthony Trent betrayed so little pleasure at the news. It so happened that Trent had given a deal of thought to this very thing, and his decision was to allow the chance of a commission to go. There was a strain of quixotism about him and a certain fineness of feeling which went to make this decision final. He loved his country in the quiet, intense manner which does not show itself in the waving of flags. To outward appearances and to the unjudging mind, Weems would seem the more loyal of the two. Weems wore a flag in his buttonhole and shouted loudly his protestations, and yet had made no sacrifice. Trent was to offer his life quietly, untheatrically, and he wanted to wear no officer's uniform in case his arrest or discovery would bring reproach upon it. In his mind he could see headlines in the paper announcing that an officer of the United States Army was a notorious, he shuddered at the word, thief. And again there was no certainty in his mind that he would give up his mode of life. In the beginning he had set out to obtain enough money to live in comfort. That, long ago, had been achieved. Then the jewels to adorn his lamp occupied his mind. And now the game was in his blood. He wanted his camp for recreation, but it would not satisfy wholly. When the war was over, there would be Europe's fertile fields to work upon. There were many things to aid him in his feeling that the turning over of a new leaf would be useless. Nothing could ever undo what he had done. Try as he might, he would never face the world an honest man. He would go to war. He would be a good soldier. It was in the infantry that they needed men, and Camp Dix received him with others. So insignificant a thing was one soldier that he presently felt a sense of security that had been denied him for years. The experiences he went through in camp were common to all. They were easier to him than most because of his perfection of physical condition. On the whole it was interesting work, but he was glad when he marched along the piers of the Army Transport Service, where formerly German lines had docked, and boarded the Leviathan. Private Trent was going over there. It was common knowledge that the regiments would not yet be sent to France. What they had learned at Camp Dix would be supplemented by a postgraduate course in England. Curiously enough, Trent found himself on the Sussex Downs, those rolling hills of chalk covered with short springy aromatic grasses and flowers. Here were 100 sights and sounds that stirred his blood. 5 generations of Trents had been born in America since that adventurous younger son had set out for the Western world. The present Anthony was coming back to the ancient home of his family under the most favorable circumstances. He was coming back with his mind purged of ancient enmities fostered so long by Britain's foes to further alien causes, coming back to a country knit to his own by bonds that would not easily be broken. It was curious that he should find himself here on the high downs, because it was from this county of Sussex that the Trents sprang. Not far from Lewes was an old house, set among elms, which had been theirs for 300 years. When he was last in England he had made a pilgrimage to it, only to find its owner salmon fishing in Norway. The housekeeper had shown him over it, a big rambling house full of odd corridors and unexpected steps, and he had never failed to think of it with pride. On that visit he had been disappointed to find the village church shut. The sexton was at his midday dinner. Trent had been under canvas only a few days when he obtained leave for a few hours and set out to the church. He counted 3 Anthony Trents whose deeds were told on mural tablets. One had been an admiral, one a bishop, and the third a colonel of dragoons at Waterloo. He sauntered by the old house and looked at it enviously. If I bought that, he thought, I would settle down to the ways of honest men. He shrugged his shoulders. There were many things yet to be done. It was only since he had been in England and seen her wounded that he realized what none can until it is witnessed, the certainty that there must be much suffering before the end is achieved. The men in his company were not especially congenial. They were friendly enough, but their interests were narrow. Trent was glad when the training period was over and he embarked in the troop train for Dover en route to the Western Front. He made a good soldier. More than one of his mates said he would wear the chevrons before many weeks, but he was anxious for no such distinction. At the time his regiment arrived in France, the American troops were at grips with the enemy. It was the first time that they held as a unit part of the line. The Germans, already making their retreat, left in the rear nests of machine gunners to hamper the pursuers. To clear these nests of hornets, to search abandoned cellars and buildings where men or bombs might be lying in wait, was a task far more deadly than participation in a battle. Only iron-nerved men, strong to act and quick to think, were needed. There was a day when volunteers were asked for. Anthony Trent was the first man to offer himself. Under a lieutenant, this band of brave men went about its dangerous task. The casualties were many, and among them the officer. He had made such an impression on his men, and they had gained such favorable mention for gallant conduct, that there was a fear lest the new officer might be of less vigorous and dashing nature. It was work, this nest-clearing danger, that Trent liked enormously. He had come to know what traps the Hun was likely to set, the tempting cigar box, the field glasses, the fountain pen, the touching of which meant maiming at the least. And against some of these trapped men Trent revived his old football tackle and brought them, startled, to the ground. It was the most stirring game of his life. But one look at the new officer changed his mood. He looked at his lieutenant, and his lieutenant looked at him. And the officer licked his lips hungrily. It was Devlin, whom he had laughed at in San Francisco. Instinctively, the man who observed this meeting sensed some pre-war hatred and speculated on its origin. Recollecting himself, Trent saluted. "So I've got a thief in my company," Devlin sneered. "I'll have to watch you pretty close. Looting's forbidden." It was plain to the men who watched Devlin's subsequent plan of action that he was trying to goad the enlisted man into striking him. In France, the discipline of the American army was taking on the sterner character of that which distinguished the Allies. No task had ever been so difficult for Anthony Trent as this continual curb he was compelled to put upon his tongue. Devlin had always disliked him. He was maddened at the thought that Trent had taken the Mount Auburn ruby from under his nose. It was because of this Dangerfield had discharged him from a lucrative position. And in the case of the Takowaja emerald, it was Anthony Trent who had laughed at him. Many an hour had Devlin spent trying to weave the rope that would hang him. And in these endeavors he had gathered many odds and ends of information over which he chuckled with joy. But first of all he wanted to break his enemy. There was no opportunity of which he did not take advantage. Ordinarily his superior officers would have witnessed this policy and reprimanded him. But conditions were such that their special duties kept Devlin and his men apart from their comrades. Devlin was a good officer and credit was given him for much that Trent deserved. It chanced one night that while they waited for a little wood to be cleared of gas, Devlin and Trent sat within a few feet of one another. It was an opportunity Devlin was quick to seize. "Thought you'd fooled me in Frisco, didn't you?" Trent lighted a cigarette with exasperating slowness. "I did fool you," he asserted calmly. "It is never hard to fool a man with your mental equipment." "Huh?" Devlin grunted. "You've got the criminal's low cunning, I'll admit that, Mr. Maltby of Chicago." He made a labored pretense of hunting for his cigarette case. "Gone," he said, sneering. "Someone's lifted it, but I guess you know where it is. Oh no, I forgot. You weren't a dip. You were a second-story man. Excuse me." He kept this heavy and malicious humor going until Trent's imperturbability annoyed him. "What a change," he commented presently. "Me the officer and you the enlisted man who's got to do as I say. You with your fast auto and your golf and society ways, and me who used to be a cop." Winning no retort from his victim, he leaned forward and pushed Trent roughly. He started back at the white wrath which transfigured the other's face. "Look here, Devlin," Trent cried savagely. "You want me to hit you so you can prefer charges against me for striking an officer and have me disciplined. Listen to this. If you put your filthy hand on me again, I won't hit you. I'll kill you." Towering and threatening, he stood over the other. Devlin, who knew men and the ways of violence, looked into Trent's face and recognized it was no idle threat he heard. "That will be a hell of a fine trick," he said a little unsteadily, "to empty your gun in my back." "You know I wouldn't do it that way," Trent retorted. "Why should I let you off so easily as that?" "Easily?" Devlin repeated. "When I get ready," Trent said grimly, "I shall want you to realize what's coming to you." "Is that a threat?" Devlin demanded. Trent nodded his head. It's a threat. Devlin thought for a moment. I'll fix you, he said. How? Trent inquired. You've tried every way there is to have me killed. If there's a doubtful place where some Boche may be hiding with bombs, whom do you send to find out? You send Private Trent. I'm not kicking. I volunteered for the job. I came out to do what I could. My one disappointment is that my officer is not also a gentleman. Devlin's face was now better humored. I'll fix you, he said again. I'll see Pershing pins a medal on you, all right. Trent wondered what he meant. And he wondered why for a day or two Devlin goaded him no more. Instead he looked at him as one who knew another was marked down for death and disgrace. It was inevitable that Anthony Trent could never know how near to discovery he was. The odds are against the best breakers of law. The history of crime told him that the cleverest had been captured by some trifling piece of carelessness. Had Devlin some such clue, he wondered? End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal by Wyndham MARTYN. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 31. Devlin's Revenge. There came a night when Devlin's men were called upon to clean out part of a forest from which many snipers had been firing, and where machine guns and their crews were known to be. It was work for picked men only, and Trent admitted Devlin made a courageous leader. The Americans met unexpectedly strong opposition. It was only when half their little company was lost that they were ordered to retreat. The way was made difficult with barbed wire and shell-splintered trees. It was one of 100 similar sorties taking place all along the Allied lines, hardly worthy of mention in the press. Trent, when he had gained a clearing in the wood, saw Devlin go down like an ox from the clubbed rifle in a Prussian hand. Trent had put a shot through the man's head almost before Devlin's body fell to the soft earth. He had an excellent chance of escape alone, but he could not leave the American officer who was his enemy to bleed to death among his country's foes. He was almost spent when he reached his own lines, and the Red Cross relieved him of his inert burden. They told him Devlin still lived. 3 days later, Trent was called to the hospital in which his officer lay white and bandaged. Although Devlin's voice was weak, it did not lack the note of enmity which ever distinguished it when its owner spoke to Anthony Trent. "What did you do it for?" Devlin demanded. "Do what?" "Bring me in after that Boche laid me out." "Only one reason," Trent informed him. "Alive, you have a certain use to your country. Dead, you would have none." "That's a lie," Devlin snarled. "I figured it out, lying in this damned cot. You saw I wasn't badly hurt, and you knew some of the boys would fetch me in later. You thought you'd do a hero stunt and get a decoration. You reckoned I'd be grateful and let up on you. That was clever, but not clever enough for me. I see through it. You've got away with outguessing the other fellows so far, but I'm one jump ahead of you in this." He paused for breath. "I've got you fixed, Mr. Anthony Trent. And don't you forget it. You think I'm bluffing, I suppose." "I think you're exciting yourself unduly," Trent said quietly. "Take it up when you're well." "You're afraid to hear what I know," Devlin sneered. "You've got to hear it sometime, so why not now?" Trent spoke as one does to a child or a querulous invalid. "Well, what is it?" he demanded. "Never heard of anyone named Austin, did you?" "It's not an unusual name," Trent admitted, but he was no longer uninterested. Conington Warren's butler was so called. And this Austin had met him face to face on the stairway of his master's house on the night that he'd taken Conington Warren's loose cash and jewels. "He's out here," Devlin said, and looked hard at Trent to see what effect the news would have. "You forget I don't know whom," Trent reminded him. "What Austin?" You know," Devlin snapped. "The Warren butler. I was on that case, and he recognized me not a week ago and asked me who you were. He's seen you too. We put two and two together and it spells the pen for you. He was English, and although he was over age, the British are polite that way. If he said he was 41, they said they guessed he was 41. I went to see him in a hospital before he went west, and he told me all about it." Anthony Trent could not restrain a sigh of relief. Austin was dead. "That don't help you any," Devlin cried. "Don't you wish you'd left me in the woods now? That was your opportunity. Why didn't you take it?" "You wouldn't understand," Trent answered. "For one thing, you dislike me too much to see anything but bad in what I do. That's your weakness. That's why you've always failed." "Well, I haven't failed this time," Devlin taunted him. "I've laid information against you where it's going to do most good." He hoped to see the man he hated exhibit fear, plead for mercy, or beg for a respite. He had rehearsed this expected scene during the night watches. Instead, he saw the hawk-like face inscrutable as ever. "I've told the adjutant what I know and what Austin said, and he's bound to make an investigation. That means you'll be sent home for trial, and I guess you know what that means. I'm going to be invalided home, and I'll put in my leave working up the case against you. They ought to give you a stretch of anything from 15 to 20 years. I guess that'll hold to you, Mr. Anthony Trent." The other man made no answer. He thought instead of what such a prison term would do for him. He had seen the gradual debasement of men of even a high type during the long years of internment. Men who had gone through prison gates with the same instincts of refinement as he possessed, to come out coarsened, different, never again to be the man they were. He would sidle through the gaping doors a furtive thing with cunning, crafty eyes, whose very walk stamped him a convict. How could so long a term of years spent among professional criminals fail to besmirch him? He took a long breath. "I'm not there yet," he said. "It's a long way to an American jail, and a good bit can happen in 3,000 miles." He was turned from these dismal channels of thought by a hospital orderly who summoned him to the adjutant's quarters. In civil life this officer had been a well-known lawyer who had abandoned a large practice to take upon himself the overwork and worries that always hurled themselves at an adjutant. He had heard of the rescue of Lieutenant Devlin by a man of his company and was pleased to learn that it was an alumnus of his old college who had been recommended for a decoration on that account. He looked at Trent a moment in silence. "When I last saw you," he said, "you won the game for us against Harvard." He sighed. "I never thought to see you in a case of this sort." "I don't know what you mean, sir," Trent answered him. "For some reason or another," the adjutant informed him, "Lieutenant Devlin has preferred charges against you which had better been left until this war is over, in my opinion as a soldier." "I'm still in the dark," Trent reminded him. Captain Sutton looked over some papers. "You are charged," he said, "with being a very remarkable and much sought after criminal. Devlin asserts you purloined a ruby owned by Mr. Dangerfield worth $175,000 and an emerald worth almost as much." "What a curious delusion," Trent commented with calmness. "Delusion?" retorted the adjutant. "What else could it be?" the other inquired. "It might be the truth," the officer said dryly. "Does he offer proofs?" "More, I'm afraid, than you'll care to read," Captain Sutton told him. "You understand, I suppose, that there are certain regulations which govern us in a case like this. I should like to dismiss it as something entirely irrelevant to military duties. You're a damned good football player, Trent, and they tell me you're just as good a soldier. But an officer has preferred charges against you and they must be given attention. Sit down there for a few minutes." Devlin, feeling the hour of triumph approaching, lay back in his bed, gloating. The hatred that he bore Anthony Trent was legitimate enough in its way. By some accident or another, Devlin was enlisted on the side of the law and his opponent against it. One was the hunter, the other the hunted. And the hunter was soon to witness the disgrace of the man who had laughed at him, beaten him, cheated him of a coveted position. Naturally of a brave and pugnacious disposition, Devlin saw no lack of chivalry in hounding a man over whom he had military authority. If Trent had been his friend, he would have fought for him. But since he was his foe, he must taste the bitterness of the vanquished. So engrossed was he over his pleasurable thoughts that he did not see the distress which came over the face of the nurse who took his temperature and recorded his pulse beat. Nor did he see the hastily summoned physician reading the recently marked chart over the bed. Instead, he was filled with a strange and satisfying exaltation of spirit. Catches of old forgotten songs came back to him. He felt himself growing stronger. He was Devlin the Superman, the captor of Anthony Trent, who had beaten the best of them. It was almost with irritation that he opened his eyes to speak with the doctor, a middle-aged grey man with kindly eyes. "Lieutenant," the doctor said gently, "things aren't going as well with you as we hoped. You should not have exhausted yourself talking. It should not have been allowed." Devlin saw the doctor put his hand under the coverlet. Then he felt a prick in his arm. Dully he knew that it was the sting of a hypodermic. Then he saw coming toward him a priest of his race and faith, and knew he came in that dread hour to administer the last rites of the church. "Doc," he gasped, "am I going?" It was no moment to utter lying comfort. "I'm afraid so." Then he saw an orderly bringing the screen that was placed about the beds of those about to die. When Captain Sutton and Anthony Trent came into the ward, the priest had finished his solemn work and was gone to console another dying man, and the physicians to make one of those quick operations unthinkable in the leisurely days of peace. Trent had no knowledge of what had taken place during his absence. He saw that his enemy was more exhausted, and as he looked he noticed that the eyes of Devlin lacked something of their hate. But it was no time for speculation. Trent saw in the sick man only his nemesis, the instrument which fate was using to rob him of his liberty. He was not to know that here was a man so close to death that hate seemed idle and vengeance a burden. "Lieutenant," Captain Sutton began, "I have here a copy of your statements and the evidence given by Sergeant Austin of the British Army. I will read it to you. Then I shall need witnesses to your signature." "Let me see it," Devlin commanded, and drew the typewritten sheets to him. Then, with what strength was left him, he tore the document across and across again. Captain Sutton looked at him in amazement. "What did you do that for?" he asked. But Devlin paid no heed to him. He gazed into the face of Anthony Trent, the man he had hated. "I made a mistake," said Devlin faintly. "This isn't the man." And with this splendid and generous lie upon his lips, he came to his life's end. Finis. End of chapter 31. End of Anthony Trent, Master Criminal, by Wyndham MARTYN. Published in 1918. Read by Anna Simon in 2013.